Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Channel. Tonight we journey back through time, across cold northern seas and into the world of the Vikings. A world of longships and distant shores, of courage and exploration, of myths and legends that still echo through history. The Vikings were seafarers, warriors, traders, and storytellers who left an indelible mark on the world. But there is so much more to their story than what we often hear. They were farmers and craftspeople, poets and lawmakers, explorers who reached lands no European had seen before. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, I invite you to like and subscribe, or share a simple thought down in the comments. It helps others find their way here, too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest, settle in, and allow the calm rhythm of history to carry you. Let's begin. The word Viking comes from the Old Norse language. When we hear the word Viking, we often think of helmeted warriors sailing across stormy seas. But the word itself has a more specific meaning. In Old Norse, the language spoken by these northern peoples, the word Viking referred to a journey or expedition, particularly one overseas. To go Viking meant to embark on a voyage, often for trade, exploration, or raiding. Not everyone in medieval Scandinavia was a Viking. The term described an activity, not an entire people. Most Norse men and women were farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople who never left their homelands. Those who did go Viking were a smaller, more adventurous subset. They sought fortune, land, or glory beyond their shores. The word has evolved over centuries, and today we use Viking to describe the culture as a whole. But it is worth remembering that to the people of that time, it meant something more specific, a journey into the unknown. The Viking Age began around the year 793. History often marks the beginning of the Viking Age with a single dramatic event. In the year 793, Norse raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, a small island off the coast of northern England. The monastery was wealthy, undefended, and isolated. To the Vikings, it was an opportunity. The raid shocked Christian Europe. Monasteries were sacred places, and the sudden appearance of foreign ships bearing armed men seemed like divine punishment. Chronicles from the time described the terror of monks fleeing, treasures seized, and buildings burned. The attack was swift and brutal, and it announced the arrival of a new force in European affairs. But the Viking Age was not simply about raiding. It was the start of 3 centuries, during which Norse explorers, traders, and settlers would spread across Europe, Asia, and even North America. The year 793 is remembered as the moment when the world became aware of the Vikings, but their journeys had only just begun. Vikings came from what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Vikings originated in Scandinavia, a region of northern Europe defined by rugged coastlines, dense forests, and long winters. The lands that today form Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were home to various Norse tribes and kingdoms. Geography shaped their way of life. Norway's western coast, with its countless fjords and islands, made seafaring essential. Sweden stretched across vast forests and inland lakes. Denmark, with its flatter terrain and proximity to continental Europe, became a crossroads of trade. Though they shared a common language and culture, the Norse were not a unified nation. They lived in small communities, each led by chieftains or local kings. Rivalries and alliances shifted constantly. What united them was language, mythology, and a shared understanding of the sea. The harsh climate and limited farmland encouraged many to look beyond their borders. Some sought better land for farming. Others pursued wealth through trade or raiding. Still others craved adventure and the chance to earn a name that would live on in songs and sagas. Scandinavia was not a place of endless winter darkness, as some imagine. Summers could be surprisingly warm, and the long days of sunlight allowed crops to grow. But winters were cold and dark, and survival required careful planning. The Vikings were shaped by their environment, and it made them resilient, resourceful, and ready to venture far from home. Their longships were marvels of medieval engineering. The Viking longship is perhaps the most iconic symbol of the age. These vessels were sleek, fast, and incredibly versatile. Built from overlapping planks of oak, they were both strong and flexible, able to bend slightly with the waves rather than breaking. This technique, called clinker building, gave the ships resilience in rough seas. Longships were shallow drafted, meaning they did not sit deep in the water. This allowed Vikings to sail up rivers, beach on shores, and navigate waters that would trap deeper vessels. A longship could cross the open ocean or glide up a narrow stream, making them ideal for both exploration and surprise attacks. They were powered by both sail and oars. A single large square sail caught the wind, while rows of oarsmen could propel the ship when the wind failed. Viking crews were skilled sailors, able to read the stars, the sun, and the behavior of birds and waves, to navigate even when land was out of sight. The ships were often decorated with elaborate carvings, especially at the prow. Dragon heads and serpents adorned the front, meant to ward off evil spirits and intimidate enemies. To see a fleet of these ships appear on the horizon must have been both beautiful and terrifying. The longship represented freedom, possibility, and power. It was the key that unlocked the world for the Vikings. Some longships could carry over 100 warriors, while many longships were relatively small, designed for speed and raiding. Others were much larger. The great warships, sometimes called dragon ships or longboats, could carry crews of 100 men or more. These were not just vessels of war, but symbols of a chieftain's power and wealth. Building such a ship required immense resources. Oak trees had to be felled and shaped. Iron rivets had to be forged. Sails had to be woven from wool, a laborious process that could take months. A large longship was a communal effort, a project that demonstrated a leader's ability to command loyalty and labor. Once built, these ships could transport entire raiding parties across the sea, strike quickly, and retreat before a defense could be organized. But they were also used for more peaceful purposes. They carried traders to distant markets, settlers to new lands, and kings to diplomatic meetings. The largest ships were sometimes used for burials. Wealthy or powerful individuals might be laid to rest inside a ship, surrounded by goods for the afterlife. These ship burials have been discovered by archaeologists, offering glimpses into Viking life and death. The ships themselves, preserved in earth or water, reveal the craftsmanship and care that went into their construction. To sail in a longship was to trust your life to wood, wind, and the skill of your crew. It was a bond between men and the sea, one that defined the Viking Age. Vikings navigated using the sun, stars, and natural signs. The Vikings did not have compasses or detailed maps, yet they crossed vast oceans and found their way to distant lands. Their navigation relied on keen observation and deep knowledge of the natural world. During the day, they used the position of the sun to determine direction. At night, the stars guided them. The North Star, steady in the sky, showed them north. By day, they could estimate latitude by measuring the sun's height above the horizon. They also watched the behavior of birds. Certain seabirds fly far from land, but others stay close to shore. By releasing birds and watching which direction they flew, Vikings could sense the presence of land beyond the horizon. They observed the color and temperature of the water, the patterns of waves, and even the types of seaweed drifting by. Each sign told them something about where they were. Some legends speak of a sunstone, a crystal that could reveal the sun's position even through clouds. While no such device has been definitively found, experiments suggest certain crystals can polarize light in ways that might help determine the sun's location. Whether myth or reality, it shows the ingenuity Vikings brought to navigation. Their mental maps were passed down through oral tradition. Experienced sailors taught younger generations the routes, the hazards, and the tricks of survival at sea. This knowledge was precious, earned through risk and remembered through repetition. Without it, the Viking voyages would never have been possible. They reached lands as far as North America, centuries before Columbus. The Viking spirit of exploration carried them far beyond Europe. In the late 10th century, a Norse sailor named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland. He sailed west and discovered a vast, icy land he called Greenland, hoping the name would attract settlers. It worked. Norse colonists established farms on Greenland's southern coast, raising sheep and cattle in the brief summer months. From Greenland, the Vikings pushed even farther west. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, led an expedition across the North Atlantic. He and his crew reached the shores of what is now North America, landing somewhere on the coast of modern-day Canada. They called this land Vinland, perhaps because of the wild grapes they found growing there. The Vikings established a small settlement at a place now known as Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Archaeological evidence confirms Norse presence there, making it the earliest known European settlement in North America. The settlement did not last long. Harsh conditions and conflicts with indigenous peoples made it difficult to sustain. After a few years, the Norse abandoned Vinland and returned to Greenland. But the fact remains: Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus set sail. Their achievement went largely unrecorded in European history, remembered mainly in Icelandic sagas. It was only in the 20th century that scholars confirmed the sagas were based on real events. The journey to Vinland was a testament to Viking daring. They sailed across one of the most dangerous oceans in the world, navigating by instinct and experience, and set foot on a continent unknown to the rest of Europe. It was a quiet, forgotten chapter of history, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. Viking women had more rights than many European women of the time. In the rigid hierarchies of medieval Europe, women often had limited legal rights. They could not own property, make decisions about marriage, or speak in legal matters without a male guardian. Viking society was different. Norse women enjoyed a degree of independence, uncommon for the era. A Viking woman could own land, inherit property, and manage a household's finances. If her husband went away on a voyage or died, she assumed full control of the family farm or business. Women could demand a divorce, and upon separation, they were entitled to a portion of the shared property. Divorce was not without stigma, but it was legally possible and socially recognized. In matters of trade and craftsmanship, women played important roles. They wove cloth, brewed ale, and managed livestock. Some women were skilled in medicine and healing, using herbs and knowledge passed down through generations. There are even accounts, though debated, of female warriors. Sagas tell of shield maidens, women who took up arms and fought alongside men. Whether these stories are literal or symbolic is uncertain. But archaeological finds, including a grave in Sweden containing a woman buried with weapons and tactical items, suggest that some women may have held warrior or leadership roles. Norse women participated in religious rituals, and some served as priestesses or seers. Their counsel was valued in matters of fate and fortune. The concept of fate, or Wyrd, was central to Viking belief, and those who could interpret it held power regardless of gender. This is not to say Viking society was equal by modern standards. Men still dominated warfare and political leadership, but compared to much of medieval Europe, Norse women had a voice and a presence that were notable for their time. They believed in gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. The Vikings practiced a polytheistic religion, worshipping a pantheon of gods and goddesses who governed different aspects of life and the cosmos. These deities were not distant or abstract. They were vivid, flawed, and deeply involved in the world. Odin, the All-Father, was the god of wisdom, war, and death. He was a wanderer and a seeker of knowledge, often depicted with a wide-brimmed hat and a cloak, accompanied by two ravens who brought him news from across the world. Odin sacrificed one of his eyes to gain wisdom and hanged himself from the world tree, Yggdrasil, to learn the secrets of the runes. He was a god who valued cunning and sacrifice. Thor, perhaps the most beloved of the gods, was the god of thunder, strength, and protection. He wielded a mighty hammer called Mjolnir, which he used to defend gods and humans from giants and monsters. Thor was seen as a guardian of order, a reliable figure who could be called upon in times of danger. Freya was a goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. She rode a chariot pulled by cats and wore a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed her to fly. She was associated with magic and was said to receive half of those who died in battle, bringing them to her hall, Folkvanga. The other half went to Odin's hall, Valhalla. Other gods included Loki, the trickster, whose cunning caused both problems and solutions for the gods. There was Frigg, Odin's wife, associated with foresight and wisdom. There was Tyr, the god of law and heroic glory, who sacrificed his hand to bind the monstrous wolf Fenrir. The Norse cosmos was complex, with 9 realms connected by the great tree Yggdrasil. These realms included Asgard, home of the gods, Midgard, the world of humans, and Jotunheim, land of the giants. The Vikings believed these worlds were interconnected, and that the actions of gods and mortals influenced one another. Valhalla was the great hall where warriors hoped to go after death. Central to Viking warrior culture was the belief in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. Located in Asgard, Valhalla was ruled by Odin. It was a vast hall with walls made of shields and a roof thatched with spears. Inside, warriors who died bravely in battle were brought by the Valkyries, warrior maidens who served Odin. These chosen warriors, called the Einherjar, spent their days feasting and their nights fighting. Each day, they would battle each other, honing their skills, and each evening, their wounds would heal, and they would return to the feast. The tables overflowed with meat and mead, an endless celebration of courage and camaraderie. The purpose of this existence was preparation. The Vikings believed that at the end of the world, during an event called Ragnarok, the gods would face their final battle against the forces of chaos. The Einherjar would fight alongside Odin and the other gods in this apocalyptic struggle. To die in battle and be chosen for Valhalla was considered the highest honor. It meant your courage had been recognized, and you would have a role in the cosmos's final moment. This belief shaped Viking attitudes toward combat. Dying of old age or illness, while not shameful, lacked the glory of a warrior's death. To fall with a sword in hand was to earn a place in legend and an eternal seat at Odin's table. Of course, not all Vikings were warriors, and not all believed they would reach Valhalla. There were other afterlives in Norse belief, including Hell, a more neutral realm for those who died of natural causes. But Valhalla captured the imagination and became a symbol of the Viking ideal. bravery, loyalty, and the willingness to face death without fear. Ragnarok was the Norse vision of the end of the world. Viking mythology did not promise eternal peace. Instead, it told of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a catastrophic series of events that would bring about the end of the world. The myths describe Ragnarok in vivid detail. It begins with 3 years of terrible winter, with no summer in between. The sun and moon are devoured by wolves. Stars fall from the sky, and the earth trembles. The great wolf Fenrir breaks free from his chains. The serpent Jormungandr, who encircles the world, rises from the ocean. Loki, freed from his punishment, leads an army of the dead aboard a ship made of fingernails. The gods arm themselves and march to battle. Odin faces Fenrir and is swallowed, though his son Vidar avenges him. Thor fights Jormungandr and slays the serpent but dies from its venom. Loki and the god Heimdall kill each other. One by one, the gods fall. Fire engulfs the world, and the earth sinks into the sea. Everything is destroyed. Yet, Ragnarok is not simply the end. The myths tell that after the destruction, the earth will rise again from the waters, green and fertile. A new generation of gods will emerge, and 2 humans, hidden away during the catastrophe, will repopulate the world. Life begins anew. This cyclical vision, where destruction leads to rebirth, reflects a worldview that accepted both the inevitability of loss and the possibility of renewal. For the Vikings, Ragnarok was not something to fear, but to accept. The gods themselves would perish, and yet that was not a tragedy. It was the nature of existence. Courage lay not in avoiding fate, but in facing it with honor. The Vikings used a unique alphabet called runes. The Vikings did not write in the Latin alphabet, used across most of medieval Europe. Instead, they used runes, a script made up of angular characters well suited to carving into wood or stone. The runic alphabet is called the Futhark, named after the first 6 letters. The elder Futhark, the oldest form, had 24 characters. Later, the younger Futhark used only 16. Runes were more than just letters. They carried symbolic meanings and were believed to hold magical power. The word rune itself means secret or mystery in Old Norse. According to myth, Odin discovered the runes by hanging himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, piercing himself with a spear and gazing into the depths of the cosmos until the secrets of the runes were revealed to him. Vikings carved runes onto stones to commemorate the dead, mark property, or invoke protection. Runestones, large standing stones inscribed with runic text, can still be found across Scandinavia. They tell stories of journeys, battles, and lost loved ones. Some are simple, while others are elaborate, decorated with intricate knotwork and images. Runes were also used for divination. A set of runestones or wooden pieces could be cast, and their positions interpreted to reveal hidden knowledge or predict the future. Whether this practice was widespread or limited to certain individuals is unclear. But the association of runes with magic persisted. Today, runes are sometimes seen as exotic or mystical symbols, but to the Vikings, they were practical tools for communication and memory. Literacy was not universal, and those who could read and write runes held a valuable skill. Skaldic poetry preserved Viking history and legends. The Vikings had a rich oral tradition, and one of its most celebrated forms was skaldic poetry. Skalds were poets who composed complex, highly stylized verses in honor of kings, heroes, and gods. Their poetry was not written down for centuries, passed instead from memory through generations. Skaldic verse was intricate, employing elaborate metaphors called kennings. A ship might be called a wave steed, A sword might be the fire of battle. These poetic devices required both skill to create and knowledge to understand. The best skalds were highly valued, often rewarded with gifts, land, or positions of honor. They traveled between courts, reciting their verses at feasts and gatherings. A skilled skald could immortalize a chieftain's deeds, ensuring their memory lived on. Conversely, a poem mocking or criticizing someone could damage their reputation. Words held power in Viking society, and skalds wielded that power carefully. Many skaldic poems were eventually written down in Iceland, where literacy became more common after the conversion to Christianity. These texts preserved not just the verses, but insights into Viking values, courage, loyalty, generosity, and the desire for fame. To be remembered was to achieve a form of immortality. Skalds did not just celebrate warriors. They also told stories of gods, composed riddles, and explored themes of love, loss, and fate. Their work blended entertainment with education, ensuring that history and mythology remained alive in the minds of each new generation. In a world without books or widespread writing, the skalds' memory was the archive, their voice was the library, and their words were the fragile threads connecting past to present. The sagas recorded Viking adventures for future generations. In the centuries after the Viking Age, Iceland became the center of Norse literary culture. It was here that the great sagas were written down, long prose narratives that told the stories of heroes, families, and legendary voyages. The sagas blended history, myth, and imagination. Some recount the settlement of Iceland, detailing the lives of early chieftains and the feuds that shaped the island's history. Others tell of legendary figures like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer or the tragic romance of the Volsungs. Some, like the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, describe the Norse voyages to Greenland and Vinland. These sagas are written in Old Norse and are remarkably vivid. They include dialogue, descriptions of landscapes, and psychological depth rare for medieval literature. Characters are complex, driven by pride, ambition, love, and revenge. The sagas do not always glorify violence. They often show its consequences, the cycles of revenge, the sorrow of loss. The authors of the sagas are mostly unknown. They were likely educated Icelanders, perhaps monks or scholars, writing in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the events they described. This distance means the sagas are not pure history. They reflect the concerns and values of their own time as much as the Viking Age. Yet, they preserve a remarkable window into the past. Through them, we hear echoes of Viking voices, their struggles and triumphs, their fears and dreams. The sagas have been translated into many languages and remain popular today. They influenced writers like J.R.R. Tolkien and continue to inspire fantasy literature and media. To read a saga is to step into a world where honor and fate intertwine, where journeys are perilous, and where the past feels both distant and strangely immediate. Viking society was organized into three main classes. Viking society, while more fluid than some medieval cultures, still had clear social divisions. At the top were the jarls, wealthy landowners and chieftains. They controlled large estates, commanded warriors, and held political power. A jarl might own a longship, host feasts, and lead raids. Their wealth came from land, trade, and plunder. In return, they were expected to be generous, providing for their followers and maintaining hospitality. Below the jarls were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Viking society. A carl owned his land or worked it as a tenant. He had legal rights, could bear arms, and participate in local assemblies. Carls were independent, but owed certain duties to their jarl, such as military service or support during disputes. Most Vikings were carls. They lived modest lives, farming the land, raising families, and occasionally joining a raiding party or trading voyage. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved people with no legal rights. Thralls were often captives, taken during raids, or descendants of earlier slaves. They performed hard labor, working the fields, tending animals, or serving in households. Their lives were difficult, and they could be bought, sold, or freed at their owner's discretion. Slavery was a significant part of the Viking economy, and thralls were considered property. However, it was possible for a thrall to earn or be granted freedom, becoming a freedman or freedwoman. Freedmen occupied a position between thralls and carls, with some rights, but less status than the freeborn. This class structure was not rigidly enforced. A carl with ambition and luck might rise in status through successful trade or warfare. A jarl who lost wealth or faced disgrace could fall. The Vikings valued personal achievement and reputation, and social mobility, while uncommon, was not impossible. The division into jarls, carls, and thralls shaped daily life, law, and expectations. But within this framework, there was room for individual variation, for honor earned and lost, for destinies shaped by courage and circumstance. Thing assemblies were early forms of democratic gatherings. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking society was the Thing, an assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and discuss community matters. The Thing was a public forum, a combination of court, council, and marketplace. Any free man could attend and speak, making it an early form of participatory governance. Things were held at regular intervals, sometimes annually, sometimes more frequently depending on the region. The most famous was the Althing in Iceland, established in the year 930. It met each summer at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley, where chieftains and their followers camped for 2 weeks. The Althing served as both a legal assembly and a social event. Disputes were heard, judgments made, and laws recited aloud by a law speaker who memorized the entire legal code. During the Thing, merchants traded goods, skalds recited poetry, and alliances were formed or broken. It was a chance for people scattered across the island to come together, exchange news, and participate in shaping their society. The decisions made at a Thing were binding, enforced by social pressure and the threat of outlawry. An outlaw lost all legal protection, and anyone could harm or kill them without consequence. This was a severe punishment, and the fear of outlawry helped maintain order. The Thing was not a perfect democracy. Women, thralls, and those without property had no voice. Wealthy chieftains wielded more influence than poorer farmers. Still, the idea that free men could gather to debate and decide their own fate was progressive for the time. The Thing model influenced later legal and political systems in Scandinavia and beyond. Echoes of it can be seen in modern parliaments and councils. It was a space where speech mattered, where reason could prevail, and where the community held itself accountable. Vikings were skilled traders who established routes across Europe and Asia. While Viking raids captured the attention of terrified monks and chroniclers, trade was equally important to Norse society. Vikings were not just warriors, but merchants who established trade networks, stretching from Scandinavia to the Middle East. They traded furs, amber, walrus, ivory, and enslaved people for silver, silk, spices, and wine. Swedish Vikings, often called Varangians, traveled east along the rivers of what is now Russia. They reached the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, establishing trading posts and settlements along the way. In Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, they were known as formidable warriors and traders. Some even served in the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine Emperor's army. Norwegian and Danish Vikings sailed west and south, reaching Ireland, England, France, and the Mediterranean. They founded trading towns like Dublin in Ireland and York in England. These settlements became vibrant centers of commerce where Norse, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon cultures mixed. Trade required diplomacy, patience, and trust. Vikings had to negotiate with foreign rulers, learn new languages, and navigate unfamiliar customs. While they could use force when necessary, peaceful trade was often more profitable. The silver coins and treasures found in Viking hordes across Scandinavia show the extent of their trading networks. Coins from the Arab world, Byzantium, and Western Europe all made their way north, evidence of the Vikings' far-reaching connections. Trade also spread culture and ideas. Vikings adopted new technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts from the peoples they encountered. In turn, they influenced the cultures they visited, leaving traces of their language, art, and customs. The Viking trader, with a keen eye for profit and a willingness to travel, was as much a part of the age as the Viking raider. They founded cities that still exist today. The Viking legacy is not just found in sagas and archaeological sites. It lives on in cities that trace their origins to Norse settlers and traders. Dublin, the capital of Ireland, began as a Viking settlement in the 9th century. Norse traders established a base on the River Liffey, and the settlement grew into a major trading hub. The name Dublin comes from the Irish dubh linn, meaning black pool, referring to a dark tidal pool where the Vikings moored their ships. York, in northern England, was captured by Vikings in the year 866 and became the center of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik. The Vikings rebuilt and expanded the city, turning it into a thriving trading center. Archaeological excavations have uncovered streets, buildings, and artifacts that reveal daily life in Viking York. In Russia, the city of Novgorod was founded by Varangian traders. It became a powerful trading republic, a link between Scandinavia and the Byzantine Empire. The name Russia itself may derive from the Rus, a term used to describe the Norse traders who settled the region. Across the North Atlantic, the Vikings founded Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. The settlement began in the late 9th century, when Norse settlers fleeing conflict in Norway sought new lands. Reykjavik, meaning Smoky Bay, was named for the geothermal steam rising from hot springs in the area. In Normandy, France, Vikings settled in the early 10th century after years of raiding and negotiation. The region was granted to a Norse chieftain named Rollo in exchange for peace. His descendants became the Dukes of Normandy, and one of them, William the Conqueror, would later invade England in the year 1066. These cities and many others carry the mark of Viking ambition and adaptability. They were not just raiders passing through, but settlers who built communities, established trade, and left a lasting imprint on the lands they touched. Viking homes were built from wood, stone, and turf. The typical Viking home, often called a longhouse, was a rectangular structure built to withstand harsh northern winters. Constructed primarily from wood, the walls were made of timber posts and planks. In areas where wood was scarce, stone and turf were used. Turf, thick layers of sod, provided excellent insulation against the cold. The longhouse was a single large room, sometimes divided by partial walls or curtains. At the center was a long hearth, a fire pit that provided heat and light. Smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof, though this was not always efficient, and interiors could be quite smoky. The family lived, ate, and slept in this space. Benches along the walls served as seating during the day and beds at night. Wealthy families might have additional rooms or outbuildings for storage, livestock, or workshops. The floors were typically packed earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes. The walls might be hung with tapestries or woolen cloth, both for decoration and insulation. Light came from the hearth, oil lamps, or candles made from animal fat. Life in a longhouse was communal. Extended families, servants, and thralls lived together under one roof. Privacy was limited, and social bonds were strong. The hearth was the heart of the home, a gathering place for meals, stories, and warmth. Building a longhouse required skill. Timber had to be cut and shaped, beams fitted together, and roofs thatched with straw or turf. It was a collective effort, often involving neighbors and kin. The finished home was sturdy, functional, and designed to keep its inhabitants alive through long, dark winters. They farmed barley, oats, and raised livestock. Despite their reputation as seafarers and warriors, most Vikings were farmers. Agriculture was the foundation of Norse society, providing the food and resources needed to survive. The climate of Scandinavia was challenging, with short growing seasons and long winters. But the Vikings adapted, cultivating crops suited to the environment. Barley and oats were the primary grains. Barley was used to make bread and ale, a staple of the Viking diet. Oats were fed to animals and also consumed by humans, often as porridge. In some regions, rye and wheat were grown, though they were less common. Vikings also grew vegetables like cabbage, onions, peas, and beans. These were stored for winter, often pickled or dried. Livestock were essential. Cattle provided meat, milk, and leather. Sheep supplied wool for clothing and meat for food. Goats, pigs, and chickens were also common. Horses were valued for transportation and status, though they were sometimes eaten in times of hardship. Fishing supplemented the diet, especially in coastal areas. Herring, cod, and salmon were plentiful. Fish were dried or salted to preserve them. Hunting added variety, with deer, elk, and wild birds providing additional meat. Farming required cooperation. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, and harvests gathered before the first frost. Families worked together, and neighbors often helped one another. The success of the harvest determined whether a community thrived or struggled through the winter. The Viking farmer's life was one of hard work, shaped by the rhythm of the seasons. But it was also a life connected to the land, where success depended on knowledge, effort, and the favor of the gods. Feasting was an important part of Viking culture. To the Vikings, a feast was more than a meal. It was a social event, a display of wealth and generosity, and a way to strengthen bonds within the community. Chieftains and jarls were expected to host feasts, providing food, drink, and entertainment for their followers. A successful feast enhanced a leader's reputation and ensured loyalty. The centerpiece of any feast was meat. Roasted pork, beef, or lamb was served in abundance. Fish might also be offered, along with bread, cheese, and vegetables. But the true mark of a great feast was the drink. Mead, a fermented beverage made from honey, was the drink of choice. It was sweet, strong, and associated with celebration. Ale brewed from barley was also common, consumed in large quantities. Feasts took place in the longhouse, with guests seated on benches along the walls. The hearth fire blazed, and the room filled with warmth, light, and the smell of cooking meat. Drinking horns were passed around, and toasts were made to gods, ancestors, and the host. Skalds recited poetry, telling tales of gods and heroes. Warriors boasted of their deeds, and laughter echoed through the hall. Feasting could last for days, especially during important events like weddings, funerals, or religious festivals. It was a time to set aside work and conflict, to enjoy the company of kin and allies. Generosity was a virtue. A chieftain who hoarded wealth and refused to share was despised, but one who gave freely, who filled the cups and plates of his guests, earned respect and loyalty. The feast was also a political arena. Alliances were formed over shared meals. Marriages were arranged. Disputes were settled. The longhouse, filled with the warmth of fire and fellowship, became the stage where the social order was reinforced and relationships were negotiated. In a world where life was often harsh and uncertain, the feast was a moment of abundance and joy, a celebration of community and survival. Berserkers were warriors believed to fight in a trance-like fury. Among the most fearsome figures in Viking lore were the berserkers, warriors who fought with a wild, almost supernatural ferocity. The word berserker may come from berserker, meaning bear shirt, suggesting they wore bear skins into battle. Others believe it means bear shirt, implying they fought without armor. Berserkers were said to enter a battle rage, a trance-like state in which they felt no pain and fought with reckless abandon. Sagas describe them biting their shields, howling like animals, and attacking with such fury that they seemed unstoppable. Some accounts claim they could shrug off wounds that would kill an ordinary man. The cause of this behavior has been debated for centuries. Some scholars suggest berserkers consumed substances like hallucinogenic mushrooms or large amounts of alcohol before battle. Others believe the rage was psychological, a form of induced hysteria or battle trance, achieved through ritual and mental conditioning. It is also possible the accounts are exaggerated, blending reality with myth to create a fearsome legend. Whether the berserker rage was real or symbolic, it had a powerful effect. Enemies feared these warriors, and their presence on the battlefield could demoralize opponents. Berserkers were often associated with Odin, the god of war, and were believed to be his chosen fighters. In peacetime, berserkers were sometimes seen as dangerous and unpredictable. Icelandic sagas tell of berserkers who became outlaws, their rage making them a threat to society. Laws were eventually passed to control or exile them. The image of the berserker has endured, becoming a symbol of wild, uncontrolled violence. In modern language, going berserk means losing control in a fit of rage. It is a legacy of warriors who, whether through skill, psychology, or legend, became synonymous with the fury of battle. They carved intricate designs into wood, metal, and stone. Viking artistry was expressed in many forms, from the practical to the decorative. They carved wood into elaborate patterns, decorating ships, furniture, and buildings. Metal was worked into jewelry, weapons, and tools, often inlaid with gold, silver, or precious stones. Stone was carved into runestones and monuments, preserving names and deeds for future generations. One of the most distinctive Viking art styles is known as the Ørnes style, named after a church in Norway. It features intertwined animals and serpents, their bodies looping and twisting in complex patterns. These designs are not purely decorative. They carry symbolic meaning, representing the interconnectedness of life, the struggle between order and chaos, and the presence of the divine in the everyday. Another popular motif was the dragon or serpent, often depicted on ship prows and weapons. These creatures were protective symbols, meant to ward off evil spirits and intimidate enemies. Knotwork, endless loops with no beginning or end, symbolized eternity and the cyclical nature of existence. Viking jewelry was both beautiful and functional. Brooches held cloaks in place, often elaborately decorated with animal motifs. Arm rings, worn by both men and women, were symbols of wealth and loyalty. A chieftain might reward a loyal follower with an arm ring, cementing their bond. Pendants in the shape of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, were common. They served as protective amulets and symbols of faith in the old gods. Even everyday objects were adorned with care. Combs, spoons, and belt buckles bore intricate carvings. To the Vikings, beauty and function were not separate. A well-made tool was also a work of art. The craftsmanship of Viking artisans reveals a culture that valued skill, creativity, and the connection between the material and spiritual worlds. Their work has survived in museums and archaeological sites, a testament to their artistry. Vikings were meticulous about personal grooming. Contrary to the unkempt image sometimes portrayed, Vikings cared deeply about their appearance. Archaeological finds include combs, razors, tweezers, and ear cleaners, all evidence of a culture that valued cleanliness and grooming. Combs made from bone or antler are among the most common Viking artifacts. They were used daily to keep hair and beards neat. Viking men often wore their hair long, sometimes braided or tied back. Beards were common and well maintained, occasionally styled or braided as well. Bathing was a regular practice. While full baths were not daily, Vikings washed frequently, especially hands and face. Saunas, a tradition in Scandinavia, were used for bathing and relaxation. Heated stones created steam, and bathers would scrub themselves clean before rinsing with water. Cleanliness was not just about hygiene, but also about social status. A well-groomed appearance signaled self-respect and respectability. This was noted by foreign observers. An English chronicler complained that Viking men were attracting Anglo-Saxon women because of their habit of bathing and combing their hair. Clothing was also important. Vikings wore tunics, trousers, and cloaks made from wool or linen. The wealthy might have silk imported from the east. Clothes were often dyed in bright colors, reds, blues, and greens, using natural dyes from plants and minerals. Jewelry and accessories completed the look, displaying wealth and taste. Personal grooming extended to both men and women. Women braided their hair, sometimes adorned with beads or ribbons. Both sexes wore rings, bracelets, and brooches. Appearance mattered in Viking society, reflecting one's status, identity, and pride. The sauna tradition continues in Scandinavia to this day. The sauna, a small heated room where steam and high temperatures induce sweating, has roots deep in Scandinavian history. The Vikings used saunas not only for bathing, but also for relaxation and social bonding. The practice involves sitting in intense heat, often pouring water over hot stones to create steam. After sweating, bathers would cool off by stepping outside into the cold air or even plunging into a nearby lake or stream. This contrast of hot and cold was believed to have health benefits, invigorating the body and mind. Saunas were communal spaces. Families, friends, and neighbors would gather to bathe together. It was a time to unwind, to talk, and to enjoy the warmth. The practice was so ingrained in the culture that it carried through the centuries. Today, saunas remain a central part of life in Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Modern saunas may be more sophisticated, but the tradition is the same. The heat, the steam, the quiet time spent in warmth, all echo the practices of the Vikings. For them, the sauna was a place of cleansing, both physical and spiritual. It was a ritual of renewal, washing away the dirt and weariness of daily life. The tradition reminds us that the Vikings, often seen as rough and warlike, also valued comfort, health, and the simple pleasures of warmth and cleanliness. They told riddles and played games for entertainment. Long northern winters meant long nights indoors, and Vikings found ways to entertain themselves. Riddles were popular, testing wit and cleverness. The Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems, includes a section called the Riddle Contest between the god Thor and a dwarf, each trying to outwit the other. Board games were also common. The most famous was Heinafátafl, a strategy game played on a checkered board. One player controlled a king and his defenders, while the other played attackers trying to capture the king. It required tactical thinking and was enjoyed by people of all ages. Pieces carved from wood, bone, or stone have been found in graves, showing how valued these games were. Dice games were played, sometimes involving gambling. Vikings wagered silver, goods, or favors on the outcome. Physical contests were popular too. Wrestling, foot races, and tests of strength provided entertainment and a way to settle disputes or prove one's prowess. Music was another source of joy. Vikings played simple instruments like flutes, lyres, and drums. Songs and chants accompanied work, travel, and celebration. Storytelling was perhaps the most cherished pastime. Around the hearth, tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors were shared. These stories were more than entertainment. They were education, preserving history, and teaching values. Children learned about bravery, honor, and the consequences of folly. Entertainment was woven into daily life. It brought people together, strengthened bonds, and provided relief from the hardships of existence. In the glow of the fire, with the cold wind howling outside, the Vikings found warmth, not just in the flames, but in laughter, stories, and shared moments. Children learned through imitation and participation. Viking children did not attend schools as we know them. Instead, they learned by watching and helping their parents. From a young age, boys accompanied their fathers to the fields, learning to plow, plant, and care for livestock. They learned to fish, hunt, and handle tools. As they grew older, they might be taught to use weapons, preparing them for the possibility of battle or defense. Girls worked alongside their mothers, learning to spin wool, weave cloth, cook, and manage the household. They learned to brew ale, bake bread, and preserve food. These skills were essential for running a home and ensuring the family's survival. Education was practical. Children learned what they needed to know to contribute to the household and, eventually, establish their own, but they also learned through stories. Elders shared tales of gods and heroes, teaching moral lessons and cultural values. Through these stories, children learned about courage, loyalty, and the importance of reputation. Play mirrored adult activities. Boys played with small wooden swords and shields. Girls had dolls and miniature household items. These toys were not just for fun, but preparation for adult roles. As children matured, they took on more responsibility. By their teenage years, they were expected to contribute fully to the household's work. Childhood was shorter in the Viking Age than it is today. The transition to adulthood came early, shaped by necessity and the demands of survival. Marriage alliances strengthened political and economic ties. Marriage in Viking society was as much a political and economic arrangement as a personal union. Families negotiated marriages to forge alliances, settle disputes, or consolidate wealth. A marriage between two powerful families could bring peace to a region or strengthen a chieftain's position. The process began with negotiations between the families. A bride price, paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, was customary. This compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor and ensured she had resources if the marriage failed. The bride also brought a dowry, property or goods, that remained hers throughout the marriage. The wedding itself was a significant event, often involving a feast that lasted several days. Vows were exchanged, sometimes in the presence of witnesses or at a sacred site. The couple's union was both a legal contract and a social celebration. Marriage brought responsibilities. The husband was expected to provide for and protect his wife. The wife managed the household, a role that carried significant authority. She controlled the keys to the home's storage, symbolizing her power over the family's resources. While love was not always the foundation of a marriage, affection and respect could grow over time. Sagas tell of couples who were devoted to one another, as well as those who clashed bitterly. Divorce was possible, though it carried social consequences. A woman could initiate divorce if her husband was abusive, neglectful, or failed to provide. Upon divorce, she reclaimed her dowry and could return to her family. Marriage was a cornerstone of Viking society, linking families, shaping alliances, and ensuring the continuation of lineages. It was a bond forged not just by love, but by pragmatism and mutual benefit. Viking funerals honored the dead and prepared them for the afterlife. Death was a transition, not an end, and Viking funerals reflected this belief. The dead were honored with rituals designed to ensure a safe journey to the afterlife. The type of funeral depended on the person's status and wealth. Common people might be buried in simple graves, wrapped in cloth, or placed in wooden coffins. Their graves might include a few personal items, tools, or jewelry to accompany them. For the wealthy and powerful, funerals were elaborate. Ship burials were the most spectacular. The deceased was placed inside a ship, along with grave goods, weapons, tools, food, drink, and sometimes sacrificed animals, or even human slaves. The ship was then buried under a mound of earth, or set alight, and pushed out to sea. These ship burials symbolized the journey to the afterlife. The ship would carry the deceased across the waters to the realm of the dead, just as it had carried them in life. Cremation was also common. The body was placed on a pyre, often with offerings and possessions, and burned. The ashes were then buried or scattered. Some accounts describe funeral feasts, where mourners gathered to eat, drink, and remember the deceased. Toasts were made, and stories were told, celebrating the person's life and deeds. The dead were not forgotten. Rune stones were erected to commemorate important individuals, ensuring their names lived on. Grave sites were revisited, and offerings were sometimes left. The Vikings believed that the way one died and was honored influenced their fate in the afterlife. A proper funeral ensured a peaceful existence in the next world, while a dishonorable death or neglected burial could lead to restlessness. Death was woven into life, not feared, but accepted as part of the natural order. The living honored the dead, and in doing so, they reinforced the bonds of family, memory, and continuity. The Viking Age lasted for nearly 3 centuries. The Viking Age, which began with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, did not end suddenly. It faded gradually over the course of nearly 300 years. By the mid-11th century, the world had changed. Christianity had spread throughout Scandinavia, transforming Norse society. The old gods were not worshipped openly anymore, and churches replaced pagan temples. The political landscape shifted as well. Scandinavia consolidated into more centralized kingdoms. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden emerged as distinct nations with kings who claimed divine authority. The era of independent chieftains leading raiding parties gave way to organized states with laws, taxes, and standing armies. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is often considered a symbolic end to the Viking Age. William the Conqueror was a descendant of Vikings, but his victory marked the end of Norse dominance in the British Isles. The last major Viking invasion of England occurred in 1066, when the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada attempted to claim the English throne. He was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and his death marked the end of an era. Trade continued, but the Vikings were no longer the fearsome raiders of earlier centuries. They had become part of the European order, integrated into kingdoms, and influenced by the same cultural and religious forces as their neighbors. The longships still sailed, but they carried merchants and pilgrims rather than warriors. The Viking Age did not vanish overnight. Its legacy lived on in the blood of settled Norse communities, in the words borrowed into other languages, and in the stories passed down through generations. But the age of exploration, raiding, and pagan gods had drawn to a close. Christianity gradually replaced the Old Norse religion. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was a slow process that unfolded over several centuries. Missionaries from England, Germany, and other Christian lands traveled north, preaching the gospel and seeking converts. Kings played a crucial role. Conversion often came from the top down. If a king converted, his subjects were expected to follow. One of the earliest Christian kings was Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who converted in the mid-10th century. He erected a runestone at Jelling, proclaiming that he had made the Danes Christian. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason, and later King Olaf Haraldsson, known as Saint Olaf, aggressively promoted Christianity. They destroyed pagan temples, forced conversions, and punished those who clung to the old ways. Their methods were harsh, but they were effective. Iceland's conversion was more peaceful. In the year 1000, the Althing debated whether to adopt Christianity. To avoid civil war, a compromise was reached. Christianity would be the official religion, but private pagan worship was tolerated. Over time, the old practices faded. Sweden was the last Scandinavian region to fully convert, with paganism persisting in some areas until the 12th century. The conversion brought significant changes. Churches were built, often on the sites of former pagan temples. The written word became more widespread as Christian monks taught reading and writing. The sagas and Eddas were eventually recorded by Christian scribes, preserving Norse mythology even as the old religion faded. Christian values reshaped Norse society. The emphasis on forgiveness, charity, and the afterlife differed from the pagan focus on honor, reputation, and Valhalla. Yet elements of the old ways persisted. Festivals were reinterpreted as Christian holidays. Pagan symbols like Thor's hammer continued to be worn, sometimes alongside crosses. The blending of old and new created a unique cultural moment, a bridge between the Viking Age and medieval Christendom. Christianity ultimately prevailed, but the memory of the gods lingered in stories, place names, and the collective imagination of the Norse people. Viking warriors left graffiti in distant places. Vikings traveled far and wide, and they often left their mark, literally. In the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, runes carved into the marble gallery still survive. They are simple, almost mundane. One reads, "Halfdan was here," a piece of ancient graffiti left by a Viking visitor, or perhaps a member of the Varangian Guard. In the Orkneys, a group of islands off the northern coast of Scotland, runes were carved inside a prehistoric burial mound called Maeshowe. The inscriptions date from the 12th century, when Vikings sought shelter there during a snowstorm. They carved messages into the walls, including phrases like "Ingigirth is the most beautiful of all women," and drawings of a serpent and a walrus. These carvings were not meant to be profound. They were casual marks left by people passing through, a way of saying, "I was here." Yet they connect us to the Vikings in an intimate way. They remind us that these were real people, with names, thoughts, and a desire to leave something behind. Vikings traveled to places far beyond Scandinavia, from North America to the Middle East. Wherever they went, they left traces. Some were grand, like cities and kingdoms. Others were small, like scratches on a wall. But all are reminders of a people who ranged across the known world and made their presence felt. They traveled along rivers deep into what is now Russia. The Vikings did not just sail the open seas, they also navigated rivers, using them as highways into the heart of continents. Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, traveled east along the rivers of what is now Russia. The Volga, Dnieper, and other waterways became routes for trade and exploration. Their shallow-drafted longships were ideal for river travel. The Vikings portaged, carrying their ships over land when rivers did not connect. They established settlements along these routes, trading with local Slavic tribes and with merchants from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The city of Kiev became an important center of Rus culture. According to legend, it was founded by Varangian traders and grew into a powerful state. The Kievan Rus, as it came to be known, was a blend of Norse and Slavic traditions. Trade goods flowed in both directions. From the north came furs, amber, and slaves. From the south came silver, silk, and spices. The Vikings acted as middlemen, connecting the wealth of the Islamic world with the markets of Scandinavia and Europe. The river routes were not without danger. Rapids had to be navigated, and hostile tribes sometimes attacked, but the potential for profit was great, and the Vikings were willing to take the risk. The legacy of the Rus can still be seen in Russia today. The name Russia is believed to derive from the Rus. The influence of these Norse traders and warriors shaped the early history of Eastern Europe, leaving a mark that endures. Some Vikings served as elite guards for Byzantine emperors. In Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Vikings found another role. The emperors of Byzantium, impressed by the Vikings' fighting prowess and reputation for loyalty, recruited them into an elite unit known as the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. They were well paid, honored, and trusted. For a Viking warrior, serving in the Guard was a prestigious position. It offered wealth, adventure, and a chance to see one of the most magnificent cities in the world. The Varangians were known for their discipline and ferocity. They carried large axes, which became their signature weapon. In battle, they formed a formidable line, and their presence bolstered the emperor's forces. Many young Scandinavians traveled to Constantinople, seeking a place in the Guard. The journey was long and dangerous, but the rewards were significant. Those who returned home brought back wealth, stories, and a reputation that lasted a lifetime. One of the most famous Varangians was Harald Hardrada, who later became King of Norway. He served in the Guard, fought in battles across the Byzantine Empire, and amassed a fortune before returning north. The Varangian Guard existed for centuries, a living link between Scandinavia and Byzantium. It was a reminder that Vikings were not just raiders, but also soldiers, mercenaries, and participants in the wider medieval world. Vikings believed in fate, a concept called Wyrd. Central to Viking belief was the idea of Wyrd, often translated as fate or destiny. Wyrd was the web of events, actions, and consequences that shaped existence. It was not a fixed, unchangeable destiny, but rather a complex interplay of past, present, and future. Every action contributed to the weaving of Wyrd, influencing what would come. The Norns, three female figures in Norse mythology, were associated with Wyrd. they were said to sit at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and weave the fates of gods and men. Their names were Wyrd, Verdandi, and Skuld, representing past, present, and future. While Wyrd implied a certain inevitability, it did not mean the Vikings were fatalistic. They believed in acting with courage and honor. Even if the outcome was uncertain, a warrior might know he was fated to die in battle, but he would still fight bravely, seeking glory and a place in Valhalla. Wyrd was intertwined with reputation. One's actions echoed through time, affecting not just oneself but one's descendants. A coward's shame could stain a family for generations, while a hero's deeds brought honor to their kin. This belief in Wyrd shaped Viking attitudes toward life and death. There was a stoic acceptance of hardship and loss, balanced by a determination to face challenges head-on. The future was uncertain, but it could be met with courage. The concept of Wyrd has influenced modern ideas about fate and destiny. It reminds us that our actions matter, that we are part of a larger story, and that how we respond to the twists of life defines us. Some Viking words are still used in English today. The Vikings left more than ships and settlements. They left their language. During the centuries when Norse settlers and raiders mingled with Anglo-Saxons in England, many Old Norse words entered the English language. Some of these words are still in everyday use. Words like sky, egg, and cake come from Old Norse. The word husband originally meant house dweller from Old Norse. The word law itself comes from the Old Norse word lag, meaning something laid down or fixed. Days of the week carry Norse influence. Tuesday is named after Tyr, the god of war. Wednesday comes from Odin, called Woden in Old English. Thursday is Thor's Day, and Friday is named after Frigg or Freya. Place names in England also reflect Viking settlement. Any town ending in by Thorpe or Thwaite likely has Norse origins. Grimsby, Scunthorpe, and Keswick are examples. The blending of Old Norse and Old English created a richer, more flexible language. English absorbed hundreds of Norse words, and this exchange contributed to the language's evolution. The legacy of Viking speech lives on every time we talk about the sky, call someone our friend, or refer to the law. It is a quiet reminder that languages, like cultures, are shaped by contact, conflict, and the mingling of peoples. Their mythology influenced modern fantasy literature. The myths of the Vikings have captivated imaginations for centuries, but their influence on modern storytelling exploded in the 20th century. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, was a scholar of Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon literature. He drew heavily on Norse mythology for his world-building. The dwarves in Middle-earth, with their halls carved in mountains and their skill in metalwork, echo the dwarves of Norse myth. The character of Gandalf shares traits with Odin, the wandering, wise, and enigmatic god. Even the name Middle-earth is a translation of Midgard, the realm of humans in Norse cosmology. Tolkien's elves, dragons, and epic quests all have roots in the sagas and Eddas he studied. Other fantasy authors followed suit. Norse mythology became a wellspring for modern fantasy, shaping everything from role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons to movies, television shows, and comic books. Thor and Loki, once worshipped by Vikings, became superheroes in Marvel Comics, introducing Norse myths to a global audience. The popularity of Norse mythology reflects its timeless themes: gods who are flawed and mortal, heroes who face impossible odds, a world where fate is powerful but not absolute. These stories resonate because they explore courage, loyalty, loss, and the search for meaning. The Vikings told their myths around fires in longhouses, passing them down through generations. Today, Those same myths inspire stories told in books, on screens, and in imaginations around the world. Archaeologists continue to discover new Viking sites. The story of the Vikings is still being written, or rather, uncovered. Every year, archaeologists discover new sites, artifacts, and insights that deepen our understanding of the Viking Age. In recent decades, advances in technology have revolutionized archaeology. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and DNA analysis allow researchers to explore sites without digging, to map entire landscapes, and to trace the ancestry of ancient peoples. In Norway, a Viking ship was discovered using radar, buried beneath a farm field. In Sweden, a woman's grave once thought to belong to a male warrior was reanalyzed, and DNA testing confirmed she was indeed female, sparking debates about the role of women in Viking warfare. In England, metal detectorists have found hoards of Viking silver, coins, and jewelry, hidden centuries ago and never recovered. Each find adds a piece to the puzzle. These discoveries challenge old assumptions and reveal the complexity of Viking society. They show that the Vikings were not a monolithic culture, but a diverse people with regional variations, evolving practices, and connections that spanned continents. As new sites are excavated and old collections re-examined, our picture of the Vikings grows richer. Each artifact, each bone, each fragment of cloth or metal is a voice from the past, whispering stories of lives lived long ago. DNA evidence shows Viking ancestry spread across Europe. Modern genetics has added a powerful tool to the study of the Vikings. By analyzing DNA from ancient remains and comparing it to modern populations, scientists can trace the movement and mixing of peoples over time. DNA studies reveal that Viking ancestry is widespread across Europe. Descendants of Norse settlers can be found in Iceland, the British Isles, France, Russia, and beyond. In Iceland, the population carries a strong Norse genetic signature, mixed with Celtic ancestry from Irish and Scottish slaves and settlers. In England, particularly in the north and east, many people have Viking ancestry. The Danelaw, the region once controlled by the Vikings, shows a higher concentration of Norse genetic markers. DNA has also revealed surprises. Some Viking graves contain individuals with ancestry from far afield, including the Middle East and Asia. This suggests that Viking society was more diverse than once thought, with traders, slaves, and travelers from across the known world becoming part of Norse communities. Genetic studies remind us that history is not just about kings and battles. It is about people, their migrations, their relationships, and their descendants. The Vikings were not isolated. They were connected to the wider world, and their legacy flows through the veins of millions today. The concept of the Viking funeral pyre is partly myth. Popular culture often depicts Vikings sending their dead out to sea on a flaming ship, a dramatic and romantic image. While ship burials and cremation both occurred, the combination of the two, a burning ship drifting into the sunset, is less well documented in historical sources. Most ship burials involved placing the deceased in a ship and then burying it under a mound of earth. The ship and its contents were hidden, preserved for the afterlife. Some cremations involved ships, but these were typically burned on land, not set adrift. The image of the flaming ship at sea likely comes from later artistic interpretations and has been popularized by films and literature. That said, accounts from travelers like the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan describe elaborate cremation rituals involving ships. He witnessed a Rus chieftain's funeral along the Volga River, where the body was placed on a ship, goods were piled around, and the whole vessel was set alight. Whether such practices were common or exceptional is unclear. myths and reality often blend in our understanding of the Vikings. The essence of their beliefs, honoring the dead, providing for the afterlife, marking the passage with ceremony, is well documented. The specific details, the exact rituals, vary and are sometimes lost to time. Viking helmets did not have horns. One of the most persistent myths about Vikings is the horned helmet. It has become an iconic image, seen in cartoons, movies, and illustrations. But there is no historical evidence that Vikings wore horned helmets in battle. Archaeological finds of Viking helmets, while rare, show simple designs, rounded metal or leather caps, sometimes with a nose guard, designed to protect the head. Horns would be impractical in combat, providing a handhold for an enemy to grab and adding unnecessary weight. The horned helmet myth likely originated in the 19th century. Artists and writers of the Romantic era, fascinated by the Vikings, added horns to make them look more exotic and barbaric. The image stuck, becoming part of popular culture despite its inaccuracy. Horned helmets did exist in ancient Europe, but they were ceremonial, worn by priests or leaders during rituals, not by warriors in battle. Some pre-Viking cultures in Scandinavia used horned headgear for religious purposes, but these were not Viking battle gear. The reality of Viking helmets may be less dramatic, but it is more authentic. The Vikings were practical people. Their equipment was designed for function, not spectacle. Still, the horned helmet endures as a symbol, a reminder that myths and reality often diverge, and that the past is as much shaped by imagination as by fact. They practiced a form of democracy through the Thing assemblies. The Thing was one of the most important institutions in Viking society. It was a gathering where free men came together to make decisions, settle disputes, and pass judgment. In a time when much of Europe was ruled by kings and lords with absolute power, the Thing represented a form of participatory governance. Things were held at various levels. Local things dealt with community matters. Regional things addressed broader issues. The Althing in Iceland was a national assembly. At a Thing, any free man could speak, present a case, or voice an opinion. Legal disputes were common business. If two parties had a conflict over land, theft, or injury, they would present their case before the assembly. Witnesses would testify. The assembly would deliberate and reach a decision. Penalties ranged from fines to outlawry. Physical punishment, like imprisonment, was rare. Instead, social and economic consequences enforced justice. An outlaw lost all legal protection. Anyone could harm or kill them without repercussion. This severe penalty encouraged people to abide by the Thing's rulings. The Thing also made laws. A law speaker, someone who had memorized the legal code, would recite the laws aloud. Changes or additions could be debated and adopted. This oral tradition ensured that laws were known and accessible, even in a society with limited literacy. The Thing was not a perfect democracy. Women, slaves, and those without property had no voice. Wealthy and powerful men wielded more influence, but the principle that free men could gather to make collective decisions was significant. It influenced the development of legal and political systems in Scandinavia. The Althing in Iceland, established in 930, is considered one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. It continues to exist today as Iceland's parliament. The Thing reminds us that the Vikings, often seen as chaotic raiders, also valued law, order, and communal decision-making. Icelandic sagas were written centuries after the Viking Age. The sagas, those grand narratives of heroes, feuds, and voyages, were not written during the Viking Age itself. They were composed in the 13th and 14th centuries. long after the events they describe. Iceland, isolated and literate after its conversion to Christianity, became the center of saga writing. Why did Icelanders write these stories so long after the fact? Partly, it was a way of preserving oral traditions. Families passed down stories through generations, and scholars wanted to record them before they were lost. Partly, it was nostalgia. By the time the sagas were written, the Viking Age was over. The old ways, the pagan gods, the era of exploration and raiding had ended. Writing sagas was a way to remember and honor that past. The sagas blend history and fiction. Some are based on real events and people, while others are more legendary. They reflect the values and concerns of both the Viking Age and the later medieval period. Characters in sagas are complex. They struggle with pride, loyalty, and vengeance. They face moral dilemmas and the consequences of their choices. This makes the sagas compelling literature. Even today, scholars study the sagas carefully, comparing them with other sources, like skaldic poetry and archaeological evidence. While not always historically accurate, they provide valuable insights into Viking culture, beliefs, and social structures. The sagas are also beautiful works of literature. They have been translated into many languages and continue to be read and enjoyed. They are windows into a world that no longer exists, preserved in words, waiting for each new generation to discover. Vikings believed trees were sacred. In Norse mythology, trees held deep significance. The greatest of all was Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash tree that connected the 9 realms of the cosmos. Its roots reached into different worlds, and its branches stretched into the heavens. Beneath its roots lay wells of wisdom and fate. The Norns dwelled there, weaving destinies. Yggdrasil was not just a symbol, but a living part of the universe. It nourished the realms, and its health was tied to the balance of existence. In the everyday world, trees were revered as well. Sacred groves served as places of worship. Offerings were made to the gods beneath ancient trees. These groves were protected, and harming them was considered sacrilege. Trees represented life, continuity, and the connection between earth and sky. Their roots reached down into the underworld, their trunks stood in the realm of humans, and their branches stretched toward the gods. The sacredness of trees was not unique to the Vikings. Many ancient cultures revered trees, but for the Norse, the image of Yggdrasil encapsulated their view of the cosmos. Everything was connected. Gods, humans, giants, and creatures all existed within the same structure, bound together by the world tree. Even today, the symbol of Yggdrasil appears in art, jewelry, and tattoos, a reminder of this ancient belief in the interconnectedness of all things. The Viking compass, or sunstone, may have been real. Navigation was vital to Viking seafaring, and legends speak of a sunstone, a crystal that could reveal the position of the sun even on cloudy days or when the sun was just below the horizon. For a long time, this was thought to be purely mythical, but modern experiments suggest it might have been real. Certain crystals, like Iceland spar, a form of calcite, have optical properties that polarize light. When held up to the sky and rotated, they can reveal the direction of the sun through clouds. Vikings may have used such stones to navigate when the sun was obscured. While no definitive sunstone has been found in Viking archaeological sites, a piece of Iceland spar was discovered in a shipwreck dating to the 16th century, suggesting such tools were used by later seafarers. Whether the Vikings used sunstones remains uncertain, but it is plausible. Their knowledge of the natural world, their keen observation of the sky and sea, and their need for reliable navigation all point to the possibility. The sunstone is a beautiful example of how Viking legends might be rooted in real practices, blending the practical and the mysterious. Vikings named their swords and gave them personalities. To a Viking warrior, a sword was more than a tool. It was a companion, an heirloom, and sometimes a character in its own right. Swords were given names, often reflecting their qualities or history. A sword might be called Legbiter, Blood Drinker, or Golden Hilt. These names were not just poetic. They reflected the bond between warrior and weapon. Sagas tell of swords passed down through generations, each accumulating stories and reputation. A sword that had slain many foes carried prestige. Losing such a weapon was a dishonor, and recovering it could be the focus of an entire saga. Swords were expensive to make. Iron had to be smelted, shaped, and repeatedly folded to create a strong, flexible blade. The best swords were pattern welded, combining different types of iron and steel to create a blade with a distinctive rippling pattern. These weapons were works of art as much as instruments of war. Hilts were decorated with intricate designs, inlaid with precious metals, and sometimes inscribed with runes. A fine sword was a symbol of status, wealth, and martial prowess. Warriors believed that a sword carried a kind of spirit or luck. A sword that had served its owner well in battle was cherished. One that failed, perhaps by breaking at a crucial moment, might be retired or even ritually destroyed. The relationship between a Viking and their sword was deeply personal. It was a partnership forged in conflict and tempered by survival. In death, a warrior might be buried with their sword, ensuring they would have it in the afterlife. These burial swords have been found by archaeologists, corroded by time but still bearing the marks of their former glory. The concept of the blood feud shaped Viking justice. In Viking society, justice was not always administered by a central authority. When a wrong was done, particularly a killing, the victim's family was expected to seek revenge or compensation. This concept, known as a blood feud, was both a legal obligation and a matter of honor. If someone was killed, their kin could demand Wyrd, a payment in silver or goods that compensated for the loss. The amount varied depending on the victim's status. Killing a chieftain required far more compensation than killing a commoner. If Wyrd was paid and accepted, the matter was settled. But if it was refused or could not be paid, the family was expected to seek revenge. This often meant killing the perpetrator or one of their kin. Blood feuds could spiral out of control, with each act of revenge prompting another. Families might be locked in conflict for generations, with deaths on both sides accumulating. Sagas are filled with tales of feuds, their causes often rooted in insults, disputes over land, or unpaid debts. The Thing provided a mechanism to resolve feuds. Disputes could be brought before the assembly, where judgments were made and compensation ordered. But not all parties accepted the Thing's rulings, and feuds persisted. Blood feuds were both a source of social stability and instability. They enforced a code of honor and accountability, but also perpetuated cycles of violence. Over time, as centralized kingdoms emerged and Christian values spread, the power of blood feuds waned. Kings claimed the sole right to administer justice, and laws were codified more formally. But in the Viking Age, the blood feud was a fundamental part of how society managed conflict, honor, and retribution. They used natural dyes to color their clothing. Viking clothing was not the drab gray or brown often depicted. The Norse loved color and used natural dyes to brighten their garments. Wool and linen, the primary fabrics, took dyes well, and a variety of plants, minerals, and even insects provided pigments. Red came from madder root, a plant that produced deep, vibrant hues. Blue was extracted from woad, a plant that required careful processing. Yellow could be obtained from various plants, including weld and onion skins. Green was achieved by combining blue and yellow dyes or by using specific plants. Some colors were more expensive and thus associated with wealth and status. Purple, for instance, was rare and costly, often reserved for the elite. Archaeological evidence, including textile fragments found in graves, shows that Vikings wore clothing in a range of colors. The wealthy could afford brightly dyed garments in multiple hues, while the poor might have more muted tones. But even common folk added color to their lives when possible. Dyeing was typically women's work, a skilled craft passed down through generations. It required knowledge of plants, mordants, which substances fixed the dye to the fabric, and the right techniques to achieve consistent colors. The process was time-consuming but rewarding. A colorful cloak or tunic was a point of pride, a sign of prosperity and care. Color also had symbolic meanings. Red might represent power or courage. Blue could signify loyalty or depth. These associations varied, but clothing was always more than mere covering. It was expression, identity, and art woven into daily life. Tattoos may have been common among Viking warriors. Accounts of Viking tattoos come primarily from outsiders. The Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered the Rus in the 10th century, described them as covered in dark green tree patterns and figures from fingertips to neck. His account suggests that tattoos were common, at least among some Vikings. However, direct evidence is scarce. Skin does not preserve well, and no tattooed Viking remains have been found. This lack of physical evidence has led to debate among scholars. Some believe tattoos were widespread, used to signify status, achievements, or religious devotion. Others argue that Ibn Fadlan's account may have been exaggerated or misunderstood. If Vikings did tattoo themselves, they would have used techniques similar to other ancient cultures. A needle or sharp object would puncture the skin, and pigment, perhaps soot or plant-based dye, would be rubbed into the wounds. The designs Ibn Fadlan described, trees and figures, fit with Norse art motifs like Yggdrasil and gods or beasts. Tattoos would have served as personal marks, distinguishing individuals and telling stories about their beliefs and deeds. In modern times, Viking-inspired tattoos have become popular. Designs featuring runes, Thor's hammer, Yggdrasil, and other Norse symbols are common. Whether historically accurate or not, they reflect a continued fascination with Viking culture and a desire to connect with that ancient past. Viking ships were often buried with their owners. Ship burials are among the most spectacular archaeological finds from the Viking Age. Wealthy or powerful individuals were sometimes laid to rest inside a ship, surrounded by grave goods, and buried under a large mound. Two of the most famous ship burials are the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, discovered in Norway. The Oseberg ship, dating to the 9th century, contained the remains of two women, along with a wealth of artifacts. Ornately carved wooden objects, textiles, sleds, and even a cart were buried with them. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, offering insights into Viking art and daily life. The Gokstad ship, also from the 9th century, held the remains of a man, likely a chieftain. The ship itself was well preserved, allowing researchers to study its construction in detail. Grave goods included weapons, tools, and even small boats, suggesting the deceased was prepared for any journey. Why bury someone in a ship? The ship was a symbol of journey, of transition from one world to another. Just as a longship carried Vikings across the seas in life, it would carry the deceased to the afterlife. The practice also displayed wealth and status. Only the elite could afford such burials. The preservation of these ships has been invaluable to archaeology. They provide detailed information about Viking shipbuilding techniques, which were otherwise known only from descriptions. The artifacts found within offer glimpses into Viking beliefs, artistry, and social hierarchies. Ship burials are dramatic reminders of how the Vikings honored their dead and viewed the journey beyond life. Norse mythology included giants and monsters. The Viking cosmos was populated not just by gods and humans, but by a host of other beings. Giants, or Jotnar, were among the most significant. They were ancient, often representing the forces of nature, chaos, and the wild. The gods frequently clashed with giants, but they also interacted with them, sometimes forming alliances or even marrying. The boundary between gods and giants was not always clear. Loki, the trickster, was a giant who lived among the gods. The giantess Skadi married the god Njord. This blending reflected the complexity of Norse mythology, where categories were fluid. Monsters also featured prominently. Fenrir, the great wolf, was destined to kill Odin during Ragnarok. Jormungandr, the world's serpent, encircled the earth, lying in the ocean. When it stirred, it caused earthquakes and tidal waves. During Ragnarok, Thor would battle and kill Jormungandr, but he would die from the serpent's venom. Then there was Nidhogg, a dragon that gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil, slowly working to undermine the world tree. These creatures were not simply evil. They were part of the cosmic order, representing the forces that challenged and tested the gods and the world. The presence of giants and monsters added drama and danger to the myths. They were obstacles to be overcome, threats to be managed, and reminders that even gods were not omnipotent. The universe was a place of struggle, where order and chaos were in constant tension. Vikings feared the Draugr, the restless undead. In Norse folklore, death did not always bring peace. The Draugr were undead beings, corpses that returned from the grave to haunt the living. They were often described as bloated, with dark, decaying flesh, possessing immense strength and malevolent intent. Draugr guarded their burial mounds, attacking anyone who disturbed their rest or sought their treasures. They were also said to enter the dreams of the living, bringing nightmares and madness. Some Draugr sought revenge against those who wronged them in life, or who failed to perform proper funeral rites. The best way to deal with a Draugr was to prevent its rising. Proper burial, offerings, and respect for the dead were essential. If a Draugr did arise, it had to be confronted physically. Sagas tell of heroes wrestling with Draugr, pinning them down and decapitating them. The head had to be placed beside the body, and sometimes the corpse was burned to ensure it did not return. The fear of the Draugr reflects Viking concerns about death and the afterlife. The boundary between life and death was seen as permeable, and not all spirits rested peacefully. The Draugr were a reminder that the dead could still affect the living, that obligations extended beyond the grave. In modern culture, the Draugr have influenced depictions of zombies and other undead creatures. Their presence in Viking lore speaks to universal fears of death, decay, and the unknown fate that awaits us all. Vikings sometimes settled disputes through single combat. When words and negotiations failed, Vikings might resolve disputes through Holmgang, a formalized duel. The word Holmgang means going to the island, as these duels were often fought on small islands or marked off ground, neutral territory where neither party had an advantage. Holmgang was governed by rules. The two combatants would fight with weapons, usually swords or axes, until one yielded, was wounded, or killed. Shields could be used, and sometimes a set number of shields was allowed, with the duel continuing until all were shattered. The purpose of Holmgang was not necessarily to kill, but to settle the matter through combat, testing courage and skill. It could be used to resolve disputes over property, honor, or insults. Sometimes, it was a way to avoid prolonged blood feuds. By agreeing to Holmgang, both parties accepted that the outcome, whatever it was, would settle the dispute. However, Holmgang could be abused. Bullies or skilled fighters might challenge weaker individuals, knowing they would likely win. This led to resentment, and eventually, Holmgang was outlawed in Iceland and other regions. It was seen as unjust, favoring the strong over the righteous. Still, for a time, Holmgang was a recognized part of Viking legal and social culture. It represented the belief that courage and strength could determine truth, that the gods might favor the righteous in combat, and that personal honor was worth defending, even at the risk of death. The age of exploration changed the world forever. The Viking Age was a time of extraordinary exploration. From their homelands in Scandinavia, the Vikings ventured across oceans, up rivers, and into lands unknown to other Europeans. They reached Iceland and Greenland, establishing lasting settlements. They touched the shores of North America, becoming the first Europeans to set foot on the continent. They sailed down the rivers of Russia, reaching the Black and Caspian Seas. They raided and traded along the coasts of Europe, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. Their journeys connected distant regions, spreading goods, ideas, and cultures. They brought Scandinavian craftsmanship to foreign markets and returned with silver, silk, and stories. They established trade routes that would endure for centuries. The Viking exploration was driven by many factors. Population pressure and limited farmland pushed people to seek new opportunities. The development of the longship made distant voyages feasible. A spirit of adventure and the desire for wealth and fame motivated individuals to brave the unknown. The impact of Viking exploration was profound. They reshaped the political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. They influenced languages, laws, and social structures in the lands they settled. They demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean, far from being an insurmountable barrier, was a highway to new worlds. Though the Viking Age ended, the legacy of their exploration lived on. They proved that courage, skill, and determination could overcome the greatest obstacles, and they expanded the known world in ways that changed history forever. Vikings contributed to the development of medieval Europe. The Vikings are often seen as outsiders, barbarians who attacked and disrupted medieval Christian Europe, but their contributions were far more complex. In many ways, they were catalysts for change and development. Their raids, while destructive, forced European kingdoms to develop stronger defenses, centralized authority, and more effective governance. The need to respond to Viking threats accelerated the feudal system, where lords protected their lands and vassals in exchange for loyalty and service. Viking trade stimulated economies. They brought goods from distant lands, introducing Europeans to new products and ideas. They established market towns that grew into major cities, centers of commerce and culture. Culturally, Vikings influenced art, language, and law. In regions they settled, Norse and local cultures blended. In Normandy, Vikings adopted French customs, but they also brought their own traditions, creating a unique culture that would later conquer England and southern Italy. Vikings spread technologies, including shipbuilding techniques, metalworking methods, and agricultural practices. Their longships influenced ship design across Europe. Politically, Viking leaders sometimes integrated into European nobility. They married into royal families, converted to Christianity, and became part of the European aristocracy. This integration brought Scandinavian perspectives into the broader medieval world. The Viking Age for all its violence and upheaval, was a period of transformation. It broke down old boundaries, connected distant regions, and contributed to the emergence of the medieval European world. Far from being mere destroyers, Vikings were also builders, traders, and innovators. Runes were believed to have magical properties. To the Vikings, runes were more than an alphabet. They were symbols imbued with power and mystery. Each rune had a name and meaning beyond its phonetic sound. For example, the rune Fehu represented cattle and wealth. The rune Ansuz was associated with the god Odin and divine communication. Runes were used in divination, to seek guidance from the gods or to uncover hidden knowledge. A set of runes, carved on wood, stone, or bone, would be cast, and their positions interpreted. This practice, though not extensively documented, is referenced in sagas and later folklore. Runes were also used in magic. Inscriptions could protect, curse, or bless. A warrior might carve runes onto a weapon to make it more effective in battle. A farmer might inscribe runes on a tool to ensure a good harvest. The power of runes came from their connection to Odin, who sacrificed himself to gain their knowledge. This made runes sacred, a gift from the gods to humankind. Not everyone could use runes effectively. Those with knowledge of their meanings and proper use were respected and sometimes feared. Misusing runes could bring misfortune, and there are stories of spells that backfired because the runes were incorrectly carved. The mystical aspect of runes has persisted into modern times. Today, people use runes for divination, meditation, and connecting with Norse spirituality. Whether these practices reflect authentic Viking traditions or are modern inventions is debated, but the belief that runes hold power beyond mere letters continues to captivate. Long winters shaped Viking life and resilience. Scandinavia's climate, particularly in Norway and Sweden, meant long, dark winters. For months, daylight was scarce and temperatures plunged. Survival required careful planning and resilience. Before winter, families worked to ensure they had enough food. Crops were harvested and stored. Livestock was slaughtered, and meat was preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Fish were dried or salted, vegetables were pickled, every bit of food was valuable, and nothing was wasted. Firewood was stockpiled. Heating a longhouse through a Scandinavian winter required enormous amounts of wood. Gathering and chopping wood was a constant task during the warmer months. During winter, outdoor work was limited, farming stopped, and travel was difficult. People spent more time indoors, gathered around the hearth. This was a time for crafts, storytelling, and maintaining equipment. Women spun wool and wove cloth. Men repaired tools, carved wood, and crafted items for trade or use. The long nights were not wasted, but filled with productive activity. Winter was also a social time. With work limited, there was more opportunity for gatherings, feasts, and storytelling. The isolation of winter strengthened community bonds. Neighbors relied on each other, and the shared experience of enduring the cold created solidarity. The harsh winters made the Vikings tough and resourceful. They learned to plan ahead, to endure hardship, and to find joy and meaning even in the darkest, coldest months. This resilience carried over into their explorations and conquests. A people who could survive Scandinavian winters could face almost anything. Their legacy lives on in modern Scandinavian culture. Though the Viking Age ended centuries ago, its influence remains deeply embedded in the culture of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. Language, traditions, and values that originated in the Viking Age continue to shape life in these countries today. Old Norse evolved into the modern Scandinavian languages. Many words, phrases, and grammatical structures have roots in the language of the Vikings. Place names, especially those ending in by, vik, or stad, recall the settlements and geography of the Viking era. Festivals and traditions sometimes echo ancient practices. Midsummer celebrations, marking the longest day of the year, have pre-Christian origins. Yule, the winter festival, was adapted into Christmas, but retains customs from pagan times. The sagas and Eddas are still read, studied, and celebrated. They are part of the literary canon, taught in schools, and referenced in art and media. Icelandic literature, in particular, remains closely tied to its Viking heritage. Cultural values like independence, resilience, and connection to nature can be traced back to Viking roots. The harsh environment and seafaring lifestyle of the Vikings fostered a spirit of self-reliance and adaptability that persists today. Modern Scandinavians take pride in their Viking heritage. Museums display Viking artifacts, and historical sites attract visitors from around the world. The Viking past is not forgotten, but honored, remembered as a time of adventure, courage, and cultural richness. The legacy of the Vikings is not just historical. It is living, breathing, and evolving in the cultures that descended from them. Viking voyages inspired later explorers. The daring of Viking explorers set a precedent that inspired later generations. Their journeys across the Atlantic, though not widely known in medieval Europe outside of Scandinavia, demonstrated that such voyages were possible. Centuries later, when European explorers like Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, they were unknowingly retracing paths the Vikings had taken. The Norse discovery of Vinland showed that land existed across the ocean, even if that knowledge was lost to most of Europe. The Vikings proved that with courage, skill, and determination, even the most daunting seas could be crossed. Their longships, designed for both river and ocean travel, influenced shipbuilding. The principles of shallow draft, flexibility, and speed informed later ship designs, contributing to the development of vessels used in the Age of Exploration. The Viking spirit of adventure, the willingness to venture into the unknown for land, wealth, or glory, echoed in the explorers of later centuries. The desire to go beyond the horizon, to discover what lay across the sea, was a legacy the Vikings bequeathed to history. Though their voyages to North America did not lead to lasting colonization, they remain a testament to human curiosity and ambition. They remind us that exploration is part of our nature, and that the unknown, however frightening, has always drawn the brave forward. Their settlements in Iceland became a democratic society. Iceland, settled by Vikings in the late 9th century, developed a unique society. With no king or central authority, Icelanders governed themselves through the Althing, a general assembly of free men. This early form of democracy was rare in medieval Europe, where monarchies and feudal lords dominated. The Icelandic settlers were often refugees, fleeing conflicts or seeking independence. They brought with them a desire for freedom and self-governance. The island's isolation allowed this experiment in democracy to flourish. The Althing met annually, and all free men could attend, speak, and vote. Laws were debated and decided collectively. Disputes were resolved through discussion and consensus, rather than by the decree of a single ruler. This system was not perfect. Powerful chieftains, called godar, wielded significant influence. The assembly could be swayed by wealth, eloquence, or social connections, but the principle of collective decision-making was established. Iceland's early democracy influenced its culture and identity. Icelanders valued independence, debate, and the rule of law. These values persisted through centuries, shaping modern Iceland, which is known for its strong democratic traditions and active civic participation. The Icelandic experiment shows that the Vikings, often seen as violent and lawless, were also capable of creating societies based on principles of fairness, debate, and shared governance. Their mythology includes the concept of Valhalla and Folkvanger. The Vikings believed in multiple afterlife destinations, and Valhalla was only one. Folkvanger, ruled by the goddess Freyja, was another hall where warriors went after death. According to the myths, Freyja had the first choice of the slain, selecting half of those who died in battle. The other half went to Odin's Valhalla. Why did Freyja receive warriors? She was a goddess of war as much as love and fertility. Her hall, Folkvang, meaning field of the host, was a place of honor. Those chosen by Freyja feasted and enjoyed her company. Much like the Einherjar in Valhalla, the existence of Folkvanger shows that Norse beliefs about the afterlife were complex. Not all warriors went to the same place, and not all paths to honor were the same. Freyja's role elevated the status of women in mythology and suggested that war and death were not solely masculine domains. For those who did not die in battle, other afterlife realms existed. Hell, ruled by a goddess of the same name, was a place for those who died of illness, old age, or other natural causes. It was not a place of torment, but a shadowy, neutral existence. The diversity of afterlives reflected the Norse understanding that death was not uniform. Different ends awaited different people, and the manner of one's death influenced one's fate. This nuanced view made Norse mythology rich and layered, offering multiple narratives and possibilities. The Viking world was interconnected with the natural world. Vikings lived in close relationship with nature. Their survival depended on understanding the land, sea, and sky. The changing seasons dictated their activities. Spring and summer were for planting, traveling, and raiding. Autumn was for harvest and preparation. Winter was for endurance and reflection. The sea was both a resource and a danger. It provided fish, a staple of the diet, and pathways to new lands. But it was also unpredictable, capable of sudden storms and treacherous currents. Vikings respected the sea, making offerings to ensure safe voyages. Forests supplied wood for building, heating, and crafting. Animals provided food, clothing, and labor. The Vikings saw themselves as part of this web of life, not separate from it. Nature was filled with spirits and forces. Landvættir, land spirits, inhabited natural features like rocks, trees, and streams. Respecting these spirits was important. Settlers in Iceland, for example, were careful not to offend the land spirits when claiming new territory. The natural world was also reflected in mythology. The gods and giants often embodied natural forces: Thor's thunder, Freyja's fertile fields, Skadi's snowy mountains. The myths explained the world and humanity's place within it. This deep connection to nature shaped Viking values. They appreciated strength, resilience, and adaptability, qualities necessary to thrive in a challenging environment. They valued the beauty of the natural world, expressed in their art and poetry. Vikings understood that they were not masters of nature, but participants in its cycles. This humility and respect can be seen in their careful management of resources and their reverence for the forces that governed their lives. And so, dear listener, our journey through the world of the Vikings comes to a gentle close. From the longships that carried them across stormy seas to the hearths where they gathered in warmth and fellowship. From the gods they worshipped to the lands they discovered and the legacy they left behind, we have walked together through a world of courage, resilience, and adventure. The Vikings were a people shaped by their environment, by the sea and the cold, by the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of survival. They were warriors and farmers, traders and poets, explorers and storytellers. They valued honor, loyalty, and the bonds of family and community. They faced death without fear, believing in fates they could not escape but could meet with courage. They left behind runestones and sagas, cities and words, myths and memories. Their story is one of human ambition and adaptability, of venturing into the unknown and finding ways to thrive. It is a reminder that history is not just about kings and battles, but about people, their hopes and fears, their struggles and triumphs. As you lie here now, letting your mind drift and your body relax, imagine the quiet of a northern night, the stars above, the sound of the sea, the glow of a distant fire. Picture a longship resting on a calm shore, its dragon head gazing into the distance. See the mist rolling over fields and forests, the ancient trees standing silent and strong. Feel the connection to a time long past, to people who lived with courage and left their mark on the world. The Vikings remind us that we are all part of a long story, stretching back through centuries, connecting us to those who came before and those who will come after. Their world is gone, but their spirit endures in stories, in words, in the land and sea they once knew. Close your eyes now. Let the rhythm of your breath carry you gently into rest. Let the weight of the day fall away and allow yourself to drift into the peaceful darkness of sleep. The longship waits, steady on the water, ready to carry you into dreams. Good night, dear traveler. May your rest be deep, your dreams be peaceful, and your journey through the night be calm and safe.